Hello, everyone. Welcome to this TransCelerate webinar on the proposed privacy methodology to improve cross-industry data sharing. My name is Diana Yee. I am the project manager for the Privacy Methodology Initiative at TransCelerate. In this next hour, we will cover a bit of an informational session on the draft methodology that is currently out for public review. Before we start on the content, I will go through a little bit of logistics and ground rules, and for those who are not familiar with TransCelerate, a brief overview of the organization. Then our speakers will take us through an overview of the initiative, a solution overview, and why we would like for you to participate in the public review. We'll close with a Q&A. Next slide. This webinar is being recorded. And for those who are not familiar with GoToWebinar, all participants on the call is currently muted. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please submit them using the questions panel. Next slide. A couple ground rules. This methodology is not legal advice. The companies or individuals who are using this methodology are responsible for working with their legal and privacy subject matter experts to ensure their compliance with relevant laws and regulations. Participation on this call is voluntary, as is using the methodology and other TransCelerate solutions. There will be a few things we will not be able to discuss and cover today, as you see on the slide below. Next slide. Now I'll give a brief overview of TransCelerate. Next. TransCelerate is a not-for-profit entity created to foster collaboration. TransCelerate is a collaborative consortium of the global R&D community that offers operational solutions that help unify knowledge to accelerate how research becomes life-saving healthcare. Our innovations make the therapies of the future happen faster. Next slide. The work of TransCelerate is informed by sponsor companies in active clinical development, so we have distinct knowledge of the real-world issues and challenges that new therapy discoveries pose. These insights allow our focus to remain on delivering practical solutions for real issues that everyone can adopt. Next. So I would like to introduce our expert panelists for today. We have Jean Spazzaro from BMS, David Eleutery from Pfizer, and Charlie Blanchard from Amgen. We're very excited to have them on the call. Now I'm going to hand over to Jean for an overview of the initiative.
Thank you, Diana. Welcome, everyone. I look forward to sharing with you a background on the TransCelerate data privacy methodology. And one of the key objectives I want to start off by saying is that the purpose of this methodology, which we'll be discussing today, as it fits into the entire journey of TransCelerate solutions in data privacy and transparency, is to advance the use of clinical data for reuse or secondary use outside of the primary objectives of the original clinical trial or research by providing data variable level options and examples which may be applied by organizations if they choose to as part of their internal privacy anonymization practices and procedures. The general intent, again, for the methodology that we'll be discussing today is to improve data utility, to reduce patient burden, advance science, and address unmet medical need. So where did TransCelerate's journey begin? Beginning in 2015, TransCelerate did publish the de-identifying and anonymization of individual patient data in clinical studies, a model approach. And this took place pre-GDPR. Then in 2019, as TransCelerate started looking at the possibility of developing a potential methodology to be used to protect participant privacy while increasing that utility of donations to our database, TransCelerate, we moved into 2020 and started to develop the first phase of this framework and paper. It's called a privacy framework for clinical data reuse, secondary data use in the pharmaceutical industry. Moving us into last year in 2022, where we developed an educational toolkit for consent specific, again, to data reuse and focusing on elements that would be particularly important to participants and sharing it with our ethics committees globally, health authorities, and clinical trial participants more specifically. That led us to where we are today and the public review of the privacy methodology in draft, which was launched earlier at the end of 2022. So that will be the focus of our topic for today. Next slide, please. This kind of just is foundational to setting where we are today and what we will be focusing on, really seeking to identify a model approach. So we've proposed something and we're putting it out for public review so we can implement a privacy safeguard process that will provide increased transparency and enable simpler utilization of clinical trial data reuse. We are in that design and launch phase, and feedback from the public will help us to improve the overall impact of this solution. Next slide. So now we'll get into the real overview of this particular tool, focusing just on the framework and opportunities for you to provide feedback. I will say we did receive a number of questions, and where possible, we are attempting to answer those questions as we go through the slides and the overview and throughout the rest of the webinar. So let's talk about what are those challenges to developing a privacy methodology and a toolkit that will help us to really tackle those key areas where it comes to privacy challenges and what we can do to really improve clinical data reuse. Regionally and locally, we know there are a broad spectrum of data privacy laws and regulations, and they are not necessarily consistent, and they vary in their approaches. There are no current industry standards for data anonymization, which leads to different policies globally. And then from an operational perspective, procedures and practices across our organizations are also not exactly consistent. There are emergent technologies, obviously, with AI and ML present their own opportunities and also a challenge to some of the efficiencies that we're looking at to support greater customization. And then, of course, lack of visibility and confidence in the data that may be shared and the way we can use that data for other clinical reuse or for other use outside of those study objectives, without knowing exactly how anonymization processes were implemented for a particular data set. It's really hard to decide where are those areas for opportunity. So again, this methodology will attempt to provide opportunities to really increase that transparency. The goal, reduce the variations, increase the transparency, clearly very important, and enable that greater data utility to reduce the overall patient burden. If we are successful, obviously we can deepen insights across populations and really increase our understanding of disease profiling. Next slide. So now when we think about what the methodology is, where are we really looking to make some improvements? The proposed methodology is a position paper that really defines those safeguards that we've attempted to put in place for relevant variable data types. So when we think about what are those data types that have the greatest impact potentially on data privacy as well as data utility, that is the focus for the 14 areas that this methodology seeks to clarify. It defines also at the variable level a logic that allows sponsors to define suitable approaches as they see fit, that fit into their own organizational practices at the actual variable level within each STDM or study data tabulation methodology. Companies can then reflect on the emerging technologies and the emergent opportunities to look at de-identification and anonymization in ways that best suit their organization. It builds upon, very importantly, builds upon existing solutions. The TransCelerate solution that we looked at earlier on in the pathway of TransCelerate's journey in privacy. It also helps to build upon work that has been done by FUSE as well as EU and local regulations. The recommendations and considerations do focus on those 14 variables that we believe really have the greatest impact on ensuring patient privacy, or yes, patient privacy at the individual participant level, as well as maintaining the highest value in utilization as well as data integrity. If we think about all the variable approaches, the goal has really been to focus on those key areas. Importantly, we do include a data checklist, which will give that transparency to a data user when it comes to how that data may have been anonymized or de-identified. And that increase in data transparency and greater transparency will hopefully give the researchers the opportunity to decide how they may be able to aggregate data, how that data can be applied for analytic purposes, and we'll get into some of the details of what that may look like. What I will say, we've received a few questions in regards to this. The intent of the methodology is to voluntarily apply it across the different variables. You do not have to use it on each variable. It's set up in a way that you can define which variables to test in the data sets that you may have available, either through the anonymization process that you've already tried before on this same data set, or using this methodology in a new data set completely and testing it either through all the 14 variables, we'll look at what those variables are, or a subset of those variables. It is completely up to an organization to decide how they want to test this methodology. I just want to make sure, sorry, I'm having a problem seeing the slide number, so just give me 1 second. What slide number are we on, if you don't mind me asking? It's not visible to me.
There is no slide number on the slide.
Sorry about that. All right, so I just want to make sure I've really, honed in on those key points. Certainly the intent of the methodology is to really give good examples of how we can use that data for purposes in addition to the primary objectives of the original protocol, generate further insights to advance science and public health, conduct additional research that is not under the original study objectives, contribute to the understanding of other diseases, develop new treatments in unrelated medical conditions, and really analyze potentially health outcomes to improve care options for our patients. The study data tabulation model defines standard structures, right, for human clinical trial study data tabulations, as well as for non-clinical study tabulations that are intended to be submitted as part of a product application to a regulatory authority. And I wanted to give that level of detail because we do have a broad scope of attendance here today, and it's important to understand the primary focus of this methodology and why we chose the actual variables that we chose. So the methodology does provide recommendations in both a recommended approach at each variable level, as well as a compatible approach to aid in anonymization of the 14 key variables that you see here. We consider 12 of them to really be the common variable types that would, again, be impacted by privacy as well as data utility. And then there's 2 novel areas because of the complexities of what we try to do when analyzing and combining data that we also try to focus on, and that is in the area of data derived from genomic data as well as seasonality. As we've said repeatedly during the webinar, it really is up to each individual organization to decide how they want to test this methodology, where they may want to apply it, but certainly the most important thing is to be able to provide us with feedback in areas where we can improve upon this methodology. As you can imagine, there are thousands of data variables. So again, focusing on the 14 that you see here, the intent really was so that we could really test this concept of what would be considered a recommended approach. And if in your organization that recommended approach does not fall into the policies and procedures within your organization test on a compatible approach. There's no restriction or requirement to picking one or the other. It is completely up to you to decide how you want to test this methodology. I can tell you we have received a lot of questions just about that. You know, what are the overall differences between when you take the methodology as a whole as opposed to in pieces, picking certain variable types? And just like with all TransCelerate solutions, the use of the methodology is completely voluntary, and you may apply one or more of the suggested approaches in any combination. In combination with that recommended or compatible approach, the use of the checklist to support the process will absolutely help the potential data users, those users of the data, understand how best the data can be used for their research purposes or not, depending on what that checklist provides. And we'll get into a little bit of detail about that checklist and the answers to how the anonymization process was applied for your particular data set. The data privacy methodology will be applied on a selective data set, obviously with thousands of options. We really needed to narrow down the scope of those variable types. And just with, like we've already said, and with previous questions, it was completely up to you to decide how to use those variables. And if you have suggestions about potential variables that we may have eliminated that could really have an impact on data privacy as well as utility and data integrity, this is a really great opportunity for you to provide that feedback to us. I will also say, within the scope of your organizational policies, if you were just to apply the anonymization methodology proposed here, it will not give you complete anonymization of the data. Sorry about that. Next slide. So this is just an example. If you haven't had an opportunity to preview the methodology before the session, I encourage you to do so. We will have our stats expert follow up immediately after this slide to give you the next flavor of how, if you're looking at a particular data variable, we give you a background on why we chose the variable, that recommended approach that you could apply to safeguard the participants' data, an example of how you could apply that recommended approach, and then some considerations for if a recommended approach does not fit within your organizational practices or in your particular data set, the way the data had been collected, a way that you could also apply a compatible approach, offering an alternative method where available. It's not always going to be available, that may not lend the highest level of data utility, but may have a more preferable risk-benefit profile based on your organizational policies. I think that's it for me. I don't know if there's any questions coming in, but at this point, I'm going to go off camera and I'm going to transition to my colleague, David. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. At this point, we wanted to provide one example from the methodology, in particular, talking about dates, to kind of give you a little bit more detail about how each section kind of details the recommended approach and the compatible approach. For dates, the recommended approach is that dates be offset using the date offset technique, and that basically means that for any given patient, a number is chosen, and this number can be sponsor defined. You may choose perhaps a range of -30 to +30, but totally sponsor determined. You may set the range, the date offset, to be, let's say, again, -30 to +30, and for each patient in the study database, a number is randomly chosen from that range, and all those patient dates are offset by that number. So basically, dates are offset or shifted to sort of mask the real dates, but to provide the capability such that date calculations among any two dates for that patient can still be done and would still be valid. All data sets for the patient all data sets for all patients are processed this way consistently for each patient. So there's no selectivity in terms of the data sets. It's all data sets for all patients. But the date, again, the date chosen for each patient may differ, such that it makes it difficult to get back to the original dates. We feel this is sort of the best recommended approach because it kind of provides the most data utility. You can still do date calculations and still have a valid date. The compatible approach is to just use the relative days that usually exist in the SDTM data sets. Usually for data sets that are SDTM format, there is a relative day column in those data sets that's kind of part of the SDTM standard. So those relative days do give utility. It's just that then you would have to delete or fully redact the actual dates just to mask those dates. So there's a little bit less data utility in the relative day calculation. We did receive a couple of questions that I want to just talk about really quickly. It is correct that for each patient, there's a different offset value, but it's usually within whatever the sponsor defines as the appropriate date range. We did receive one question, I think, would you get future dates if you did this date offsetting? If you choose a very high range or a very large range, potentially possible, but much of the data that we share in TransCelerate is HTD, historical data, such that by the time you're ready to share the data, a number of months, maybe even years of change have gone by, such that any offsets you add would not result in future dates, even if you choose a reasonably large value. And I think that is the core part of this this particular slide. So please, let's go to the next slide. Just really quickly, just a couple of notes about the data transparency checklist. It is an additional document to prepare and put thought into and effort into, but we feel that for the data recipient, it is also a really very useful, very helpful document. For those persons who receive anonymized data sets, it may be unclear or ambiguous to them exactly what rules have been applied, what columns have been dropped, what columns have been transformed, have any rows been deleted or transformed. Having the data checklist, we really do believe, will help the recipients of the data understand the data and do the appropriate analyses, just so there's no ambiguity or miscommunication about what has been changed and what has been altered and so forth. Next slide, please. For the next section, we'll talk a little bit about why organizations should participate in the public review. And I will go offline now, and we'll segue over to Charlie. Charlie, over to you.
Thanks very much, David, and just thank you to everybody. I mean, let me start out by saying that I know it's a early Monday morning on the West Coast. I guess you're a little further ahead of us on the East Coast or on anywhere else you are in the world, in Europe or elsewhere. You've taken time out of your day to listen to us, and you know, already that really delights me in terms of the participation that we're already seeing in this, because we really cannot do this without all of you. And so you've heard from Jean and David and myself, 3 individuals of the many TransCelerate member companies who've contributed to this, too many to name, and given this is the privacy methodology, I'm not sure I have their consent to name them all, but a lot of work and effort has gone into this, but this is only part of the journey, and we really hope that it inspires you to participate in this public review process. And we know that there's a number of different individuals from different backgrounds here, and everybody has something valuable to contribute here. So the way we've kind of broken it down and thought about this in terms of, you know, the methodology is intended to be an asset that can be used around data sharing. Now, you heard from Diana and Jean the origins of this project, right? It was around secondary reuse of data, of clinical trial data within the TransCelerate platform at TransCelerate. But our hope is that we can consider some of the methodologies here in other applications of data sharing. And so why should you contribute, and who are those that we value the input from? So on the left hand side here we have who we refer to as the data providers, those who are sharing the data. And we've listed the types of individuals, you know, myself as the Amgen's Global Data Protection Officer, but you know, the other valuable input that we welcome here, whether your background be law, whether your background be statistics, as a data scientist or an anonymization specialist, there is a lot that we believe that you can bring to the table. So we thank you in advance to those of you who do choose to submit questions and feedback, and we'll go over the methodology for how to do that in a second. And we've already had a number of questions as David and Jean have been answering there at the beginning before we even got going. So thank you to all of you. And then the data users, so those who stand to benefit from being able to advance the science in the broader use of this data in an appropriate way. And again, you know, those that may use that data being by statisticians or other researchers, etc. So if we go to the next slide, really, because this is kind of the crux of the issue. Why a public review period, right? So we've heard at the beginning around some of the issues and the challenges that we face when it comes to data sharing. And certainly, you know, it's for each company that provides data to be comfortable with how they're complying with data protection or privacy laws. But our hope is that we can bring some understanding to the acceptance of common approaches to certain types of data variables, with the goal of what we sometimes refer to as a positive sum game, right? So enhancing patient privacy and at the same time providing greater utility out of the data that's being shared. So that's one key aspect of why a public review period. You know, and then going in reverse order here, already talked about on the previous slide the different backgrounds of those of you who have joined us today, and those of you who have already submitted questions, and those of us that worked on this project. And so the greater the input, hopefully the greater the credibility and the acceptability of the solutions that we provide here. Your practical experience in working in this, no matter what angle you're coming from, is incredibly valuable to us. And then last but not least is to ensure, you know, enhanced visibility around what is happening in our creation of our efforts here, with the hope that, you know, we don't duplicate efforts and that we look for any potential gaps in the solutions that we're providing here to enhance potential adoption of this methodology. So, you know, we thank you in advance for taking the time. And if we go to the next slide, and as you've seen on every single one of these slides, we have 3 weeks from this Friday in order to receive your feedback. So how do you receive feedback? Well, there's kind of a three-stepped approach here. Number one is to download and review the methodology yourselves. Hopefully many of you have already done that, and I suspect from the questions we received, many of you have indeed done that, and there is the hyperlink, and I'm sure it will be shared multiple more times than yes, there it is again in the chat window for you. There's a survey form to fill out, which you will find on that website. And you know, thanks to the TransCelerate team who've made this incredibly intuitive and simple to follow along with, the 1, 2, 3 method. And then finally, the informational resources based on, you know, our presentation and discussion today, and as we'll get to in a second, answering some of the questions. Yeah, with that being said, I think I'm going to hand it back to Diana and leave ourselves plenty of time to answer all your questions here. But thank you in advance for taking the time to do this. Next slide, please.
Thank you so much, Charlie, David, and Jean. That was great. So that concludes our presentation portion of the webinar. If you have any questions, please definitely send them through the questions panel. We already have received a few, which we will jump into here in a minute. Before then, I do want to highlight the upcoming event that is going on later this week. It's another webinar focused on ICH E8. Again, you know, we welcome everyone and anyone to be able to join these webinars and be part of a discussion. So now we're going to jump into Q&A. And I'm going to, I'm going to pull the first here that we've gotten. So for the example around date, David, maybe you can help us understand, using date offsetting, how is the re-identification risk calculated?
Can you hear me?
David, do you want to start us off?
Can you hear me, Diana?
I can,
Yes.
yep.
Okay, good. It's an interesting question. It's a very technical question, and unfortunately, I don't have the answer for that, Diana. We'd have to take it offline, and unless someone else has that particular answer for us here.
Dean or Charlie, would you guys like to?
Yeah, could you read the question again? I just want to be clear.
Sure. For date, using date offsetting, how is the re-identification risk calculated?
So I'll take a stab at that. Look, I mean, I think this is one input variable into that calculation. I don't think you can calculate it specifically just off that one variable type. You need to look at the totality of all the variable types, because, you know, anonymization is a process, and it's the sum total of all those different. So I don't think you can calculate it just off of that one variable.
Yes, I agree with what you just said, Charlie, and it's also a lot of what the risk, the way risk is often done is using that K anonymity principle, where you can kind of figure out all the combinations of the key variables. You sort of bin patients into categories and stuff like that. And dates is a little bit different. I don't exactly know how you factor date offsetting into that. It seems a little bit different to me. But again, maybe we can take it offline and think about it a little bit.
Yeah, and I would encourage anyone, to look at that date section, because there are a couple of different approaches that can be applied based on your particular data set, and that probably would factor into it as well. Just a suggestion.
Another question along those lines for dates, how was the fuse date shifting methodology kind of considered into that?
We basically relied a lot on that fuse recommendation. I think it's very similar. I apologize, I can't remember the exact way the fuse recommendation went, but I believe it's pretty much in line with what was recommended by fuse in terms of again, not showing actual dates, but offsetting dates per patient on some value within some random selection within a date range or a range of values to offset by.
Thank you, David. I have another question here. Charlie, maybe you can kick us off on this one. This methodology seems to be speaking a lot about the rules-based anonymization. Is there any approaches towards risk-based statistical approach?
Yeah, I mean, danger of repeating myself on one of my previous answers there. You know, anonymization, right, is about the entire process. So, you know, elements of both quantitative and qualitative assessment need to go into any approach that looks at anonymization. So yes, we've chosen to focus on a discussion of 14 specific variable types here, but that is part and parcel of the entire anonymization process. It isn't anonymization in of itself. So you've got to look at those other factors as well. So, you know, fair point, but at the end of the day, you know, this isn't intended to be, you know, you don't follow this approach and you're done with anonymization. These are inputs into the overall methodology and approach.
Yeah, and I would even say that using that rule, the recommended and compatible rules approach, right, is a step in the direction of then assessing from a qualitative perspective where that risk is. And depending on where your risk scores may land, which of those approaches would then obviously be a piece of the whole process of anonymization. So I think there are a couple of ways to look at that as a risk-based approach as well.
That's great. We have another question here. Dean, maybe you can kick us off on this one. Thoughts on age band for anonymization? Is this one of the 14 domains that was shared previously on the slide that's in the methodology?
Say it again, but I think the answer is yes. I just want to make sure that I heard the right variable type.
Age banding. So
yes.
Is age band one of the 14 domains
yes,
in the methodology?
Yes, it absolutely is. Obviously, variable approaches can be applied, both that recommended and alternative approach. So yes, age banding is one of those variables that's addressed in the methodology.
Great. All right, I'm going to take this one to Charlie, if you have a perspective here. It's just a comment from one of our attendees, is that apart from reusing the data, there is also benefit in fair research principles be applied by reducing biasedness with the data review. Do you have any thoughts or perspectives on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think one part, a large part of the discussion, and a large part, hopefully, of what you've seen in the methodology is the importance of explaining what was done to the data before it is being shared. I mean, this is a key aspect, you know, and this is discussed in many places where we talk about, for example, if something's been redacted, then you explicitly acknowledge the fact that there was something there and that it was redacted, and certainly any other you know, techniques that are applied to the data, it's critically important to the researcher to understand you know, the method by which the data has been altered. So yes, I mean, I would agree with that comment in principle and idea, but I don't know, Jean or David, you got anything additional to add on that?
No, I think you've got it.
Yeah, and as far as it's the fair principles, I mean, I'd have to really dig into them to do an assessment of where it is, but I certainly think that the concepts behind it all have absolutely been applied to the methodology in practicality.
Great. So I'm going to pull a question from pre-submitted questions. Is there a particular area or areas in the methodology where consensus across a working group was hard to get to?
Yeah, I can take that one, Diana. So, I mean, I think the two that I would point to in the list of 14 would be the ones that we identified as novel areas, and they were so those two are data derived from genomic data and the seasonality, both of which led to very long debates. And I think on the first one, on the genomic data, I mean, it started off with, well, what do we even mean by genomic data? So are we talking, you know, genomics, transcriptomics, proteomics? Like, where do we draw the line? And, you know, I do also think it's an area where the science is fast evolving, and depending on the specific data in question, the potential risk of re-identification may be high. So, you know, I would encourage you to check out that particular area, because it's also a critically important area in terms of advancing the science and the potential therapeutics for grievous illness. Where we landed on was, you know, a preference towards being able to retain certain categorized pieces of data, such as genotype or chromosomal change, but I would certainly say that is an area that continues to need work. The other area where we had very long debates was around seasonality, and seasonality, I think, which overlaps with two of the other 12 variables listed above, namely dates and geographic location. I think for obvious reasons, is another one where there was a lot of debate around how does seasonality interplay with those two other variables. You know, given on, did the participant reside in the northern hemisphere, the southern hemisphere? You know, what do we even mean by seasonality in terms of, are we talking about just, you know, winter, spring, summer, etc., or are we talking about other types of seasons such as flu season, etc.? So that was another one that a lot of discussion went into, and certainly I think any contributions anybody can make who's on this call into those two are the two that I would in particular highlight.
And the only thing I would add to that, and absolutely, Charlie, you're spot on, is this also speaks to the very broad scope of experts that we've been consulting on these topics. Because again, depending on where you are in drug development, what molecule you may be exploring in your clinical trial space, the impact on safety, all of the key stakeholders really needed to weigh in on these particular novel areas in particular. So yeah, feedback would be greatly appreciated.
And I would only add that another kind of novel, evolving field that we haven't really tackled in this methodology, but I think will become of interest in the future. Images, image files, image data. There's a lot of discussion out there. How can you share both clinical data and image files for things like oncology scans and so forth? Lots of discussion, lots of issues. Definitely something that in the future would benefit from discussion and harmonization.
Absolutely. So, and that kind of speaks to that one point where we mentioned AI and ML, so machine learning and automated intelligence. A lot of things happening from the imaging perspective there, and what will be acceptable as part of the submission. How's the privacy really going to be? It's the privacy, it's the interpretability of those images. All of those things are an evolving area that we will need to continue to monitor as this methodology moves forward, as with everything, right?
Yeah, I think you guys actually did a fantastic job touching on one of our questions here around considerations for adding lab data into the domain. So is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
So anybody want to jump? I mean, lab data, are we talking lab data, just, the fundamental lab data? Are we talking about the sample data and how we manage the control of that data? There's lots of different ways to look at lab data, but I will defer to the experts on that.
No, I don't think there's anything that we haven't already touched upon. I mean, much like David said, imaging data, I think there was even some discussion around analysis of some work that's being done on voice data, because voice scans also can be very useful. And so there's still a lot more work to be done. I'd classify that as another one that's in kind of the novel area that unfortunately we haven't had the opportunity to tackle in this methodology, but is clinically relevant and important. And I would say the same for all the imaging and lab data. I'd put under that same bucket.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and lab data can be interesting, challenging. Sometimes you may the main point about lab data points that we might need to eventually discuss is outliers. How do you handle outliers? Do you automatically redact them? Do you have some sort of rule in place? Again, another interesting topic that warrants discussion.
Thank you all. I do want to touch on another question here around, what do we see as the true value of this solution, and both the methodology and that checklist would bring to the research community. I know you all touched upon this at the start, but maybe just from your own perspectives in your role. David, you want to start?
Yeah.
Or
I can start. So I think the main goal we hope the methodology achieves, again, is more consistency in anonymized study data across a wide variety of projects, therapeutic areas, companies, organizations, and so forth, such that at the end of the day, more and more robust analyses can be performed by the people who receive the data. If we can, again, I want to use the harmonized word instead of the standardized word, but if we can achieve more harmonization in how data is anonymized across the various data types and the various, again, TAs, projects, etc., just at the end stage for the people doing the actual analyses, they can get more data that's more harmonized, and more utility for more and more different types of analyses. I think that's the end goal and what we'd love to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, I'm picking up on that final piece. I mean, there's only, you know, it's only worth sharing data if the data is useful. And so certainly anything that increases that utility whilst at the same time preserves the privacy in what I referred to earlier as that positive sum game, that's really the end goal from my perspective. It's privacy and utility.
Good point.
And I'll end on, and which kind of led me to some of the comments I sporadically shared earlier. I mean, ultimately, if we do this, and the intent initially was to improve the way we share data across the TransCelerate database, and we learn quickly, ideally, the more harmonization we can get in the data types and the sharing of that data and transparency about that data. When we talk about reducing burden on patients, because that's really what we're all here for, right? We want to improve public health, we want to advance science, and we can't do that if we don't have some common language in which we talk about how do we anonymize the data in a way that truly protects privacy, but doesn't really hinder what we know patients want us to do for them. But it's tricky, it's that balance, it's that sensitivity, it's the policy stuff that we all, you know, this isn't exactly an easy topic to address for all the right reasons. We want to always remain ethical, but there are some things we really need to try to address in order to get to that perfect place. For me, another key thing, and the reason I wanted to spell out STDM specifically is because we talk about it from a clinical perspective, but those same data sets and variables are key to the preclinical and that non-clinical data that we collect. And if we want to get to a submission and a place where we're really advancing translational medicine and translational safety, we do need to get to some commonality. We have that data. We have that data within our own organizations. We have it when we collect it from external sources. But if we can't get to some common place where how we protect that data and how we share it, we'll never be able to use it to really advance those places like translational safety. So that's an area that I'm really passionate about. I always have been. And so these common approaches become more and more important if we really want to get there.
And I think to pick up on the point about transparency, we cannot stress enough the importance of the transparency in terms of, you know, if we look at that data provider, data user kind of slide that I presented earlier, if I'm a data user, and I can immediately see through the transparency of how this data has been manipulated that I may not be able to complete the analysis I need because there has been, you know, a change of a variable, whatever, then it also drives us towards the best use of everybody's time. So I wouldn't, and to be able to draw logical conclusions, but just by looking at the fact that, hey, I know that these particular variables have been redacted, or I've taken it up to, I don't know, this measure level or whatever it may be, that already will set me off down the right path of the analysis that I'm proposing to do, and whether or not this data set is fit for purpose for what I'm trying to do with it.
Great perspective. Thank you all for sharing that. I'm going to take a question from the audience here. Is this methodology from U.S. data subjects only? If outside of U.S., have any regulators or data protection agencies been involved in the discussion?
It's Charlie, I'll take that one. So the brief answer to the question, is this for US data subjects, is no. This is for global participants and global trial subjects. And certainly the methodology and approach is based off of the concept and idea that what we're looking at is there a reasonable basis to believe that the recipient of the data could re-identify the data subject, and that principle and idea you find within the privacy laws around the world. Again, you are to consult with your own privacy teams in terms of the interpretation, but certainly the methodology was never intended to be a US only approach. In terms of have, you know, data protection authorities or other regulators, they have certainly been encouraged, and this methodology has been shared with many of them because they provide a very, very valuable input as well. So the answer to your question is no, it's not US only. It's definitely meant to be a global approach. And I should say that includes EMA as well, I believe, have been asked to comment on this.
Specifically, we've gotten some regulators showing great interest in this methodology and the feedback from this public review period. So again, we strongly encourage everyone to complete the survey, with recommendations, suggestions, or even just alignment that, this was great. I think it is something definitely of interest for those regulatory authorities. All right. I'm going to lob this question to you, Charlie. Does sharing, I think you touched upon this, does sharing everything on what has been with the data during anonymization process jeopardize on re-identification?
No, I mean, I don't think so. I mean, I think this goes back to, anonymization is a process. And as a part of that process, you have to think about who are you sharing the data with and what are the instruments by which you are, it isn't just about the data, but for example, if you're sharing through some sort of a platform and there is a data sharing agreement, that data sharing agreement will contractually obligate the recipient not to try to re-identify the data. If you're talking about public data sharing, well, I mean, I think that's a kind of a different question, and obviously sometimes we talk about this kind of thermostat approach towards anonymization, and in a case where data is going to be publicly shared, I think you'd have to turn the thermostat up or down. I'm not sure how that analogy works, but my personal belief is no, that shouldn't impact it, but it all depends on how is that data being shared. What is the data situation, right? By which who are the parties involved, and what are the other controls that you can rely on, including not just contracts, but also presumed adherence to ethical principles of research as well. And again, that's going to depend on the particular data situation. But Jean or David, I'd welcome, if you have any additional thoughts on that one.
I would agree with what you just said, Charlie. I would also say that for the data checklist, if a given sponsor is kind of concerned about putting information in there, they can sort of adjust what they put in there. For instance, if you're doing date offsetting, you can say date offsetting was done on a by patient basis, but perhaps omit the date range if you're concerned that, well, if I provide the date range, maybe that'll give too much information for people to re-identify. Just sort of think about what you're putting in there and maybe adjust it a little bit based on the context, as Charlie was saying. Who is this data going to? What's the context? What are the protections in place, agreements in place, and so forth?
Yeah, and I reflect on what Charlie say, David, but in terms of the anonymization is just one piece of the bigger thing that's happening here when we share data. And how we share the data, the privacy and the security, safeguards that are in place for the transfer of that data and the controllership of that data, and the processing of that data, right? So those are the other pieces that certainly have to fall within the remits of any data sharing agreement or contracts that you may have in place, whatever you have in place for controlling and monitoring your vendors that may be responsible for that transfer of data. So that's the other piece, right? If this is just one component out of the total that needs to be really structured in a way that protects the data and the privacy of the patient associated with that data. So I think it's all of that.
Yep, definitely.
Great. We have another question here. Jean, I'm going to come to you first. How will changes to the data privacy laws in the future reflected in the methodology?
So as with all things TransCelerate, we do always try to keep things contemporaneous. So we have a regulatory council, we have people in our companies who like Charlie, are the data protection officers. They are on top of all evolving regulation when it comes to data protections. And I think one of the reasons why TransCelerate was willing to take this huge body of sensitive work up is because we do have the experts within our organizations that have a finger and a pulse on the evolution, constantly evolving regulation in this space. And the hope is that with continued support from TransCelerate and the experts that have been involved to date, that we keep an eye on it, just like everything else, and we have a process in place to do so.
I can chime in on a couple of additional thoughts, and again, to stress, as we said earlier, it's for each data provider to consult with their own privacy counsel on this. But if we take as a good illustration of the evolution of this, or maybe lack thereof, right? So if we think about the framework that many of us who work in privacy or in data sharing are familiar with in the EU. So the General Data Protection Regulation, Recital 26, is where we find the description and discussion around when data is rendered anonymous, right? And the words that appear in there, all are means reasonably likely to be used to identify the natural subject. Very helpfully, if you turn the clock back and you look at the predecessor to the General Data Protection Regulation, the Data Protection Directive, which was originally drafted in 1990 and was passed into law in 1995, it's Recital 26 again. And Recital 26 looks remarkably similar in its description of what it means to render data anonymous. So there you see a practical example of 21 years apart, even though it's a little bit more verbose in the GDPR, where it goes on to talk about, consideration of all objective factors, including the amount of time, the technology available, etc. And certainly this methodology is a point in time, right? And technology does change, etc. I mean, I think it's the principles will need to be reassessed as technology advances. I don't personally see data privacy laws introducing a radically different definition of anonymization. I think they're always going to say using all the means reasonably likely to identify an individual. And whether you're looking at, HIPAA and how that defines de-identification, you're looking at GDPR and anonymization, you look at some of the new state privacy laws, you will see all the means reasonably likely. Reasonably likely is the key aspect there.
Great. I think we're going to take one last question, and that is, with implementation of EU CTR, any thoughts on evolution, declining phase of anonymizing the data for secondary reuse? So Charlie, do you want to kick us off?
Say that again. So in context of the EU clinical trial regulation, what was the piece that came after that?
Any thoughts on evolution or declining phase of anonymizing the data for secondary reuse?
Declining phase. I'm not sure. Okay, Charlie, you can take it.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for asking me the difficult question. Do I have any thoughts on this? I mean, look, I think it's an interesting intersection, the EU CTR with GDPR and with the plethora of other pending regulations that we have coming in the EU around the digital health space, the pending AI Act, etc. It's very, I mean, the reason why I'm kind of hesitating to answer, because I think it's very difficult to answer, given the plethora of all those different regulations and how they're all going to work together. I mean, I think for me, some of the questions that we work through and that we debate and struggle through, I don't know that the CTR necessarily changes some of those difficult conversations that we've already been having. Looking at this from a patient perspective and an understanding of what is explained within the ICF, how you explain anonymization, which was another TransCelerate initiative that was alluded to at the beginning. I think all of these kind of interplay together. So I think I've done a pretty good job of not answering the question at all there. So just talking, difficult question. I don't know is the answer.
And Charlie, I'd hate to call you out again, but I will. You sit on the FPIA data governance working group, right? And so I feel like these connectivities are there. Is there some hope and real possibility that having those connections across Europe through FPIA, public-private partnerships, that we will make it less complicated, perhaps, or more?
I think more discussion is needed, Jean, is how I would summarize it, between many parties.
Okay. We can always have hope.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We are at the top of the hour. We go to the next slide. We do welcome any kind of questions. If you have any, please contact us on the email. The slides and the recording will be made available to everyone shortly. And direct links to the methodology and public survey is also been sent in the chat as well as on the page. So we look forward to hearing from you, and thank you all for attending, and special thank you to our speakers. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank
Take care.
you.